So I'm excited to talk to you about how to make food a key part of the climate solution instead of an emitter. As you know, the pandemic has shuttered factories and grounded airlines, which has been a benefit to our air quality. But even in a pandemic, we still need to eat. And with every meal, we have the opportunity to think about how our food choices impact the world. And just to put this in perspective, this isn't an insignificant question. Today, 41% of our greenhouse gas emissions are absorbed by Earth's oceans and land-based ecosystems. 24% of that is absorbed by land sinks. So it's either absorbed by land or oceans. 24% is absorbed by land. That leaves 59% remaining in the atmosphere. Croplands and pastures cover 35 to 40% of Earth's ice-free land, which presents us with a big opportunity. By changing our agricultural methods, we can use those lands not only to provide us with food, but can we use them to also sequester emissions? So that all is to say in introduction, I'm Deborah Kimelman-Block. I'm coming to you from my farmhouse in Southern Maryland, which is the ancestral home and current home to the Piscataway Indians, who frequently don't get enough credit for their use of regenerative agricultural practices, some of which are still used today. Let me just, okay, cool. I'm just gonna mute one person, got it. Okay, sorry about that. 12 years ago, I started Whole Foods. And Whole Foods supplies regenerative, 100% grass-fed meat to the kosher community. I'm also an owner of the cattle ranch that supplies the beef. Before Whole Foods, I had a vegetarian kitchen because I didn't want to support industrial meat production. And then I read The Omnivore's Dilemma by Michael Pollan, and I wanted to actualize his ideas. And what I found was no non-industrial kosher meat. I wanted to purchase non-industrial kosher meat, and there was nothing out there. And so I started Whole Foods. Before industrialization, pastures were organic, ranchers worked symbiotically with nature and animals, and meat was an expensive treat. The industrial farm's focus is on maximum profit at the expense of animal welfare, environment, and our health. Factory farms have taken over the global meat supply, and currently 24% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture. Our planet just can't handle the burden. Clearly, we need to minimize emissions from agriculture, but what if we could do better than that? Unlike other emitters, agriculture also has the potential to sequester emissions. So now I'm going to share with you a short, just like 3.5-minute introduction to regenerative agriculture. Okay. Give me 1 minute. This is Whole Foods. Okay.
If you're like most people, you're probably feeling a little hopeless about climate change and the damage we've done to our planet. Well, now there's a new way to look at climate change and how to deal with it that might just turn that hopelessness into hope. Climate change, as we know, is all about too much carbon in our atmosphere. But carbon is not our enemy. It's the building block of life. Everything alive is made of it, even us. The problem and the solution are simply a matter of balance. Let's step back and look at the 5 pools where carbon is stored on planet Earth. Starting about 500 million years ago, when plants first appeared on land, carbon began to cycle in an amazing balance between these pools, a balance that allowed for life as we know it to evolve. Then one life form, that would be us, figured out how to extract carbon from the fossil pool, which was pretty much a timeout zone for carbon. We've been burning it for energy, putting into play, and disrupting that balance. The way we manage land and do agriculture is moving even more carbon into the atmosphere. Specifically, we've moved 880 billion tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, which is heating up the planet and destabilizing our climate. The oceans have absorbed a lot of this excess carbon, throwing off the ocean's balance, resulting in ocean acidification and accelerating a mass extinction of sea life. So in order to save life as we know it, of course we need to stop burning fossil carbon. The big question is, where do we put this excess carbon to get the cycle back in balance? The good news is that the answer is literally right under our feet. It's the soil. Plants, using sunlight and water, naturally perform photosynthesis. They pull carbon in from the air and turn it into carbohydrates, sugars. Then they pump some of these sugars down through the roots to feed microorganisms who use that carbon to build healthy soil. Voila, carbon moved. The plants pump it in, and the soil stores it. Nature's living technology is amazing. Scientists have recently discovered that applying a thin layer of compost can help regenerate healthy soil, setting up an ongoing feedback loop that brings more and more carbon into the soil each year. Together with other regenerative practices like not tilling the soil, planting trees and cover crops, and planned grazing, we can build and retain billions of tons of soil carbon. This is carbon farming. This is regenerative agriculture. Unlike more carbon in the atmosphere, more carbon in the ground is good for us. It makes healthy soil, which is nutrient-rich and full of life and holds way more water. This means more nutritious food and crops that are more resilient in the face of drought. That's good news for farmers, families, and everyone who eats. Remember this, the way we grow our food, fiber, and fuel either puts carbon up into our atmosphere or pulls it down into the ground. The regeneration of soil is the task of our generation. Our health, the health of our soils, and the health of our planet are one and the same.
So just to reiterate, the carbon in the atmosphere is too high, the carbon in the soils is too low. Historically, agriculture has depleted soil nutrients, which resulted in, for example, the destruction of the Fertile Crescent, which is no longer fertile. And this has ramped up recently. Half the carbon in our soils have been lost in the past 200 years. However, regenerative agriculture, which fosters maximum plant growth and photosynthesis can be used to enrich our soil instead of deplete it. So as you saw, just to get into that clip a little bit more, the basic principle is to nurture dense and diverse plant growth. So plants use photosynthesis to bury carbon. Carbon enables the soil to hold water and stabilizes the soil through building roots and root networks. It also helps make nutrients in the soil available to plants and animals. Practices include not tilling, cover crops, diversity, and grazing animals. The reason why, so grazing animals build dense, diverse pastures, and dense and diverse pastures are one of the best ways to increase photosynthesis. Many of the farming practices used in regenerative agriculture have been around as long as farming has and include a rich diversity that stems from indigenous to African traditions and even rabbinic. For example, Shabbat and the Shemitah year emphasize rest. And the rest period, or the period of regrowth, is a primary feature of both regenerative agriculture and Shabbat and the Shemitah year. So I'm going to share my screen again in a couple of slides. Yeah. Okay. Oops. Here we go. So, these are principles that we were discussing, and this is so the way the soil works, or soil science, is new. Like I said, the practices, many of the farming practices have been around for forever, but the way soil works is new, the soil science. The biggest discovery was of the mycorrhizal fungi that enable plant roots to extend and communicate beyond themselves to a network that connects plants and minerals and other plants. So as you can see on the right, there's this vast network of fungi, and all that fungi is this new discovery, is interconnecting all the plants and microorganisms in the soil, and that is what makes the plants more nutritious to humans and animals, but it also brings carbon into the soil. The fungi are made of carbon. So when they grow, when you foster those fungi, then the carbon is going to, the more you foster them, the more carbon is going to be sequestered. Most of the prairie's carbon sequestration happens below ground. Prairie roots can dig into soil as much as 15 feet, as you can see from this picture. So this is regular agriculture on the right, and prairies just, going wild on the left. Prairies can store as much carbon below ground as a forest can store above ground. And prairies can be, in some ways, more stable than forests, because if you have a fire in a prairie where most of the carbon mass is below ground, it can regenerate quickly. Whereas when most of the mass in the forest is above ground, in a fire, all that carbon goes up into the atmosphere. So, in fact, prairie was once the largest carbon sink in the world, much larger than even the rainforest. In addition, healthy soils need less fertilizer and other additives, and they can hold more water, which helps with erosion, flooding, problems withstanding drought and weird weather. So they're more resilient to climate change. And all that helps the farmer's bottom line. So just as Adam, or human, is the root for Adamah, or soil, so too is our health rooted in our soil's health. A study published by the Journal of the American College of Nutrition demonstrated that there are reliable declines in key nutrients. Hang on. Mute somebody. Okay. So there are reliable declines in key nutrients found in 43 different fruits and vegetables over the past 50 years. As Dr. Christine Jones writes, over the last 70 years, the level of every nutrient in almost every kind of food has fallen between 10 and 100%. An individual today would need to consume twice as much meat, 3 times as much fruit, and 4 or 5 times as many vegetables to obtain the same minerals and trace elements as available in those same foods in 1940. Fortunately, regenerative agriculture presents a better path forward by producing more nutrient-dense food. All right. Hang on a minute. There we go. But it's a myth that all animal agriculture is destructive. In fact, it can be used to sequester carbon. It isn't about the how or what is being raised. I'm sorry, it isn't about the cow or what is being raised. It's about the how or how the farming practices, what farming practices are used to raise it. As we know, conventional feedlot beef is very destructive to the environment. In this picture, the left is overgrazed conventional pasture. It's an overgrazed conventional pasture. The right is a pasture that uses regenerative agriculture. Qantas, which is a respected environmental research firm, did a life cycle analysis of a regenerative ranch in Georgia. And while there's debate on what should be included in the life cycle analysis, the sequestration rate, as you can see, is meaningful. So if you're looking, starting from the left, the positive scale is emissions, stuff going up into the atmosphere, and the negative stuff, below the line is being sequestered. And when you add all that together, it has a total emissions of negative 3.5, which means that raising these animals sequesters carbon or is a net negative. But how can we restore the dense, diverse pastures of the Great Plains, which were once one of the world's biggest carbon sinks? So we need to look at how the plains were formed. And they were formed with nature and nurture. They were formed by large herds of animals being chased by predators, frequently moving from place to place. And after leaving an area, there would be long periods of rest and regrowth for those plants, like Shemitah or Shabbat. Likewise, the Plains Indians purposefully moved buffalo herds to specific areas of land that were depleted in order to fertilize and aerate them. So how do we mimic this in a modern day ranch? We use fencing, and the technology around fencing has advanced significantly in recent years, and that is what is enabling regenerative agriculture using animals. If you can see on the left picture, the farmer's holding, and you can't even see him holding it, he's holding a wire, a white wire. And that wire is all that these animals need to stay in a piece of, say in a paddock, a piece of the pasture. And what's significant about that is it's so easy to move a singular wire. And that has enabled farmers to move animals around much more frequently. So clearly there are many benefits to regenerative agriculture, but we are specifically here to look or to discuss how it potentially can sequester carbon. Now, first of all, I feel like it should be noted that no sequestration or drawdown practices should ever be thought of as replacing reductions in emissions. Turning off the emissions tap is the quickest way to slow down climate change, and any drawdown should only be used in addition to turning off that tap. The regenerative agriculture, what the drawdown does, what the sequestration does, is reduces the amount of greenhouse gases that are already in the atmosphere. But we need to turn off that tap. That should be number one. Regenerative agriculture also does it in a way that's pre-tested. Photosynthesis is age-old and is a comparatively inexpensive tool when as opposed to mechanized carbon extraction, like, I don't know if you all have seen Snowpiercer or like that sort of human machine that gets rid of carbon or emissions from the atmosphere. So if you're only looking at drawdown or sequestration and not including all of regenerative agriculture's other benefits like resilience to climate change, runoff, erosion reduction, and more nutrient-dense food, then while regenerative agriculture's sequestration rate is meaningful, there's still many challenges. For example, sequestration is hard to calculate. It can vary dramatically per location, practices, and calculation method. Effects can lessen over time because soils can get saturated and not able to absorb as much. If you remember, like a lot of the atmospheric carbon and emissions is from fossil fuels. And that, was in like a timeout zone that was like way, way deep, not a part of, the carbon cycle. And once we release those into the atmosphere, the soils, the soils won't be able to hold all of what's in the atmosphere because it came from these deep pools. So another potential challenge for regenerative agriculture is that if farming practices change, so if you're using regenerative agriculture, you may be able to draw and sequester carbon, but if that changes, if then like someone else buys your farm or you stop leasing it and the practices change, the sequestered carbon could be re-released into the atmosphere. Another problem is that, or another challenge is that it requires more land. And so we need to focus regenerative agriculture on rebuilding marginal soils where crops don't grow well, of which there, much of the world is marginal, or like on the this picture on the left, too hilly. So, so we need to focus regenerative agriculture on places like that, as opposed to places that are growing crops well, because we need to feed a lot of people. And if forest is destroyed because we need more land to feed the world, then we've defeated our purpose, our drawdown purpose. The other problem or challenge is that methane sequestration is hard. Although it can be sequestered through regenerative agriculture, things like silvopasture, which is on the right, or agroforestry can do it even better. And then there's the final question of whether enough nitrogen can be produced to stop fertilizer use when you're growing, for example, like corn or soy on an industrial scale. That said, despite all those challenges, since grasslands play such an important role in storing carbon, the bottom line is simple. Sustainable, optimized grazing and restoration of degraded pasture is crucial for drawdown as well as for future food production. So what are some things that we can do to support regenerative agriculture? One is vote with your meals, eat a plant-based diet, and when you eat meat, eat regenerative meat. Two is support legislation that eliminates farm subsidies for industrial corn and soybeans, support legislation that ends confinement commodity animal production and ends antibiotics in animal feed. And specifically, you can support Representative Pingree, who's from Maine. She has an Agricultural Resilience Act, which is sort of the Green New Deal for agriculture. And it includes all these things and much more.